Dr. Curry, the forensic psychologist appointed by Johnny Depp's lawyers, analysed Amber Heard and diagnosed her with BPD, or borderline personality disorder, and HBD, or histrionic personality disorder. Dr. Curry also found no signs of PTSD present. I would add that she certainly fulfills the criteria for NPD, or narcissistic personality disorder. These disorders often co-occur. In Amber's case, from my observations, her fear of abandonment and volatility, characteristic of BPD, are closely intertwined with her inflated sense of self, characteristic of NPD, and her desire for approval and attention, characteristic of HBD. In this video, I like to discuss certain aspects of Amber's behaviour that have not been touched upon and look further at how Amber's background may have formed the personality and the disordered form it has now. We'll look at specific examples of how Amber's behaviour and speech are consistent with her pathology. As a note before we start, these are merely my observations and should not be taken for diagnosis. I recommend you watch Dr. Curry's testimony if you want more depth on how she constructed Amber's psychological profile. If you notice, Amber addresses the jury in the same manner she addresses her audience. When testifying, the witness can choose whether to look at the lawyer or the jury when answering the questions, of course, but let me point out that a victim of abuse is more likely to feel intimidated and very self-conscious when having to disclose such personal and painful details of their lives to such a large audience.
About to die. I'm for real about to die, this is it, and I was coming to terms with it. When I think about it, oh my God, I almost died. And I lived. I don't want anybody else to go through that. That was horrible.
They tend to blame themselves or feel deeply ashamed, and it emanates through their gestures and facial expressions. They're more likely to avoid eye contact or look down, fidget, take long pauses, or engage in self-soothing gestures. Sometimes you can hear their voice shake as they struggle to hold their tears back.
My relationship with my mother is still marbled with pain, anger, and resentment.
They also wouldn't recover from that as quickly as Amber does. This is because it's extremely difficult to fake an emotion while evaluating a question, as each task engages a different brain area. If you notice, Amber's emotional act drops as soon as she's asked a question during the cross-examination.
Your lies have been exposed to the world multiple times, right?
I haven't lied about anything I've been here to say.
You sat here and told this jury that the events in Hicksville started with Mr. Depp getting really upset about a woman leaning on you. Is that correct?
Amber Heard has the demeanour of a performer. She pushes herself artificially to produce some tears. Her gestures are forced and unnatural. She's too composed and aware of what's happening for her to be spontaneous, and she's never the one at fault. It's all the rest of the world. Just like Dr. Curry said, this rules out any PTSD but rather points at a malignant personality. Notice the switch from putting on a performance and the genuine reaction that occurs when Camille calls her out. All of a sudden, she drops the act, reacts defensively, forgets about her audience, and gives us a moment of insight into the real Amber Heard. She snaps because she's called out for playing the victim, which of course she vehemently denies.
Wanted to make those claims seem believable.
They are believable. They were
You wanted
believable.
them to be seen, as a noble victim of domestic violence,
I
didn't
have
you?
never wanted to be seen as a victim. Nor have I ever called myself one.
When Johnny defies the veridicality of her testimony, she stares at him, no signs of indignation or hurt in the face. Her posture is dominant and she smirks. She knows he speaks the truth, and that's the only thing that causes her inner outrage. Amber Heard is your typical attention seeker with her own version of how events transpire in the world. This is typical for narcissists who put themselves at the center of the world. It's either them who got hurt, or them who is great, or them who got abandoned. The sad truth is that this projection is so strong that narcissists truly believe that they really are the victim, but all they are is the victim of their fake narratives. Amber is convinced that she's in the right. She believes her story wholeheartedly, even though she knows it's not true.
And the man you beat up numerous times. Right, Miss Heard?
I could never hurt Johnny.
Everyone's a liar but me. It's my version of the story that's correct. I watched a couple of interviews with Amber, and let me tell you that Hollywood and politics is full of Ambers. It's true that people often deceive themselves even if they sense there's something wrong with them, because of the charm these people tend to emanate, because of their appearance, pretty privilege, or because they seem to know exactly what to say to the person to make them like them. This may happen because the person feels insufficient, and having the attention of someone so glamorous makes them feel better about themselves. This seems to have been Johnny's case as well. Narcissists pick out those with more submissive personalities, someone they can dominate. In fact, they mimic or imitate the person they interact with. The more they want to make a good impression of the person, the higher the likelihood that their gestures, facial expressions, way of dressing, and overall demeanour will mimic theirs. Amber has a combination of DSM-5 cluster B disorders. These people in reality struggle a lot with understanding the gestures people naturally show because they don't understand or feel the emotions behind them. Many of them actually struggle to achieve any accurate mimicry. Over time, they learn to hone their gestures, but they still remain very shallow. Looking at Amber's older interviews, she's so shallow and pretentious that it's painful to watch. The root of this often goes back to childhood and adverse experiences. Normal development teams with maternal touch and emotional stimulation that make the related brain areas develop properly. If this is missing, the person can develop into a cold individual that requires excessive stimulation, such as in the case of psychopaths, to feel something. That's what drives the characteristic excessive recklessness and thrill-seeking. They may also fluctuate between anxious or depressive states and violent and aggressive outbursts. One of the major and most noticeable red flags is the quick switch between facial expressions. If you pay attention, you'll see how quickly Amber goes from smiling to a poker face, for example, which is not normal. People who understand these emotions know how to pretend they feel them, and generally do a much better job at their imitation than people who don't, because they can conjure the emotion up to be reflected in the face. This ability is what distinguishes a good actor from a bad one. On the other hand, this is a narcissist trying to impress. To demonstrate, we'll look at another narcissist with these affects.
I'm just trying to decide if I'm comfortable even talking about that.
These people learn how to imitate others' behaviour over time within different contexts, but it's just like learning how to talk when you're already an adult. Your speech, if ever developed, ends up being faulty, and the nuances that accompany it are never fully appreciated. And indeed, shifting emotions, shallow and exaggerated emotions, combined with impressionistic but vague speech, are characteristic of those with a histrionic personality disorder. Another thing to notice is the way she looks around when talking. If you look at someone with social anxiety disorder, for example, they tend to avoid eye contact, but the transitions between the eye contact and looking down, which tends to be preferred, are quicker. In Amber's case, she looks around the room a lot and in longer spells, which tends to be a gesture of self-aggrandizement and disinterest in the other person. When recounting the anxiety issues situation present in Amber, Dr. Curry testified childhood trauma was likely present in Amber, and Amber's sister Whitney testified that their father beat them sometimes. Amber testified that her father has, quote, struggled with alcohol and drug abuse issues his whole life, end of quote, and that, quote, he's an addict and an alcoholic and he was very violent, end of quote. She adds, quote, my father was violent to my mother growing up. They loved each other, but he was very violent to her until the end. She passed away, end of quote. Now, she clearly uses this to make herself be seen as a victim, because she only discloses this at the court. But in one of her past interviews, she makes herself into an ideal daughter with an ideal father. The way she talks about him is actually quite interesting.
I think this is a photo of you and your father, and this I would get. Look at that. There's a cowboy right there.
Yeah, that's my daddy.
Well, it looks fantastic.
He's great.
How long has he had the mustache? All your life?
My whole life. My whole life. He comes out. He's my date to all my premieres and you know, functions, and he's on set all the time. He's great. Baby girl, I don't know what he's saying to me. You better tell him to go.
That's right.
I was like, Daddy.
Yeah.
Daddy, he just, he doesn't realize it's a real mustache.
What I think might have happened in Amber's case is that her father narcissistically projected himself onto Amber, who assumed the role of the wished-for son, and in her future relationships the role of the father, or the abuser. She became the golden child of a narcissist, whereas Johnny became the scapegoat. If you're interested in this topic, have a look at my Tywin Lannister video where I delve deeper into the dynamics between narcissistic parents and their children. She rejects the role of a woman or anything feminine to not become like the mother or the victim, because children traumatized this way believe that you can either be a victim or an abuser. In this case, generalization to feminine traits bears the connotations of weakness, incompetence, and stupidity. As a child, she possibly concluded that violence gets you what you want and that unhealthy relationships are normal. What these people fail to realize is that there is no choice, really. If you choose either, you will become either a victim of someone else's abuse or a victim of your own shadow. In her relationships, Amber assumes the role of her father, emulating the son her father never had. And indeed, she's the one who wears pants in every relationship and uses violence to establish it. We know that both from Johnny's testimony about their relationship and about her abusive manners towards her sister Whitney, and from her past relationships. Apparently, she got arrested for domestic violence in the past. It's likely that both Johnny and her mother are pushovers. In a victim-abuser situation, rather than retaliate, they're more likely to end up with depression or self-destructive behaviours as a form of coping, such as alcohol or drug abuse. Johnny has a rather soft character like his father, and resolves to internalizing the issues he faces the way his father did, according to his testimony. It's quite interesting how the unconscious dynamics work in relationships. Looking at this relationship closely, Johnny is the projection of Amber's abused mother, whereas Amber is the projection of Johnny's abusive mother. They're like the opposite sides of the same coin. Where Amber deals with her abuse by assuming the role of the abuser, Johnny unfortunately remains the victim, unable to stand up for himself. Now there's a number of possible explanations as to why people reenact violent behaviour that was their daily bread as children. What seems likely in this case is that the reenactment provides a temporary release of libido that got stuck as a result of trauma. Since no proper way to deal with strong emotions had been taught, and the connection between emotions and moral behaviour is not appreciated because it's never made, these people resolve to what they're most familiar with. Children with violent parents may become violent simply because they internalized it as the standard behaviour. This tends to happen especially when they are the violent parent's preferred child, or a child confidant as we call it. Of course, violence isn't perpetuated in every case, as there are many different factors to take into account, and Johnny is a good example of this. Behind this confident, faultless mask is stunted emotional development that transpires through aggression and anxiety. The need for constant gratification, seeking reassurance and approval could stem from the inability to self-soothe that was never learned in childhood. The individual believes that the others must be at their disposal constantly. They fear abandonment profoundly because they can't regulate their emotions themselves, like a child that needs constant touch and support from the parents, but is left alone in a dark room instead. At the same time, people affected in this way can never establish a genuine connection with anyone because they're excessively demanding and don't see people for who they really are. but rather they perceive them as either great as long as they act as they want them to, or horrible as soon as they deviate from the projection cast on them in the black and white worldview. This is because people with BPD often fail to grasp self-representations, especially the contradictory ones, due to their inability to develop complex representations of other people's mental states and intentions, and due to them suffering from poor cohesion of the self and identity disturbances. The reason why they're so reactive and easily affected by the outer events in a way that focuses narcissistically on themselves is because they try to find their self, which often feels as non-existent, which may be due to childhood neglect. They form their self externally, overprojection of libido in psychoanalysis, rather than internally. This may be due to what Heinz Kohut called self-object needs not being met. These are every child's needs to mirror and idealize a positive role model close to them, usually the parent, and form an alter ego around them, for example through copying the parent's behaviour. Unfortunately, in the same manner, negative behaviours are developed. However, the needs, in order to be met, require positive feedback, and if it's lacking, the child, now an adult, may be stuck seeking them out forever, but now with a pathologized personality that's unresponsive to affection. What we see happening is in fact rejection characterized by violence towards their partners and friends. At first, they approach strangers with a charming facade to protect the precarious but at least some image of their self that they have formed. The change that occurs once you get to know them is striking, and it has a reason. Children with reactive attachment disorder, for example, shun physical or eye contact, don't want to be touched, and react aggressively, paradoxically, exactly out of the need for physical touch. One possible case scenario behind it is that when a baby or a child is not soothed, its elevated cortisol is not returned to its normal state. Stress response that's ignored becomes the standard state in a way that we call learned helplessness. The child withdraws emotionally and reacts aggressively as a defense mechanism. Something similar tends to happen with narcissists. Another feature that can be found in those with a traumatic past is obsession with or an utter disregard for a controlled routine. I noticed that this is Amber's case as well when Johnny recounted how she would always take his boot off when he returned home after work, and when he did it himself once, she got visibly upset and said it's her job.
I would come in the house or the hotel, and she would sit me down on the couch and give me a glass of wine and take my boots off, and it became a regular thing that she did, this kind of routine. So I sat down on the couch and I took my boots off, and suddenly Miss Hurd approached with this look on her face and she just said, "What did you just do? What did you do?" I said, "What do you mean?" "You took your boots off." I said, "Yeah, yes I did. You were busy, you know." No, that's my job. That's what I do. You don't do that. I do that." "Okay, all right then." And then she said, "Let me get you a glass of wine." And she brought me the glass of wine.
Traumatized children often find themselves in unpredictable environments that lack stability and routine on one hand. For example, they never know when to expect the parent to strike them, or on the other hand, in extremely controlled environments with pathological routines from which they can't risk any deviation, lest they be stricken, such as in religious cults. It's possible that when this is never corrected, the individual tries to simulate stability they lacked, or emulate the stability ingrained in them via forcing a routine, no matter how bizarre, onto their environment. When dealing with narcissists, this is the way they simultaneously exhibit control over the other person, which is again an attempt to regain control that they lacked in childhood. Unfortunately, this attempt is externalized, which only makes them sink deeper into the role of an abuser. In other cases, such as in Johnny's, we can see pathological deviation from the routine via substance abuse. Unfortunately, cluster B personalities are hard to treat due to a lack of introspection. They're so focused on how the outer world affects them that they fail to see how their behaviours affect the world and themselves. My overall impression of Amber is that of severe emotional dysregulation, unrecovered attachment disorders, and deliberate cruelty.